They laughed when they walked away. They thought they had won. They thought they had finally outsmarted you, escaped accountability, upgraded their life, and left you behind to deal with the damage. In their minds, the story was already over. They were the hero. You were the lesson. They were moving forward. You were supposed to remain stuck. But something unexpected happened. Life didn't unfold the way they imagined. The doors they expected to open didn't open. The peace they thought they would find never fully arrived. The certainty they projected to the world started cracking behind closed doors. And now, while very few people can see it, an entirely different reality is unfolding beneath the surface. Listen carefully. One of the hardest truths for a betrayer to face is the realization that leaving wasn't the victory they thought it would be. At first, pride keeps them distracted. Ego keeps them occupied. The excitement of a new chapter temporarily masks the consequences of their decisions. But eventually silence arrives. And when silence arrives, reality starts talking. That's when old conversations return. That's when memories resurface. That's when uncomfortable questions begin appearing in the middle of the night. Questions they spent months or even years avoiding. What if they were wrong? What if they misunderstood you? What if the person they walked away from was never the problem? That's where today's message begins. Because this isn't about revenge. It's not about wishing harm on anyone. It's about understanding what happens when people betray someone they never truly understood. It's about the moment they realize they weren't nearly as independent, powerful, or in control as they believed. Over the next few minutes, we're going to explore why so many betrayers eventually find themselves trapped in regret, why the clarity they mocked becomes impossible to ignore, and why the greatest victory a chosen one can ever achieve is moving forward without looking back. Sometimes the punishment isn't what happens to them. Sometimes it's finally understanding what they threw away. Number 1. The pawn realization. One of the most painful realizations a betrayer eventually faces is discovering that they were never as in control as they thought they were. At the time, everything felt justified. They had their reasons. They had their narrative. They had people agreeing with them, validating them, encouraging them to believe they were making the right decision. Every step away from you felt like proof that they were winning. Every bridge they burned felt necessary. Every warning they ignored felt insignificant. But that's the strange thing about deception. It always feels like wisdom while you're inside it. Only later does it reveal itself for what it truly was. Listen carefully. Many people assume betrayal begins with malice. Sometimes it does. But more often, betrayal begins with influence. A suggestion here. A rumor there. A small seed of doubt planted at exactly the right moment. Over time, that seed grows. The person becomes more defensive, more suspicious, more certain of things they never actually verified for themselves. Before they know it, they're making life-changing decisions based on emotions they didn't even realize were being manipulated. That's why so many people who betray the chosen one genuinely believe they're acting independently. They think every conclusion was their own. They think every decision came from personal insight. They think they're the architect of the situation. But years later, when the dust settles, a disturbing pattern begins emerging. The people who encouraged the separation disappear. The voices that fueled the conflict move on. The crowd that once cheered them on stops caring. And suddenly they're left alone with the consequences. That's when the questions begin. Why did they trust certain people so easily? Why did they dismiss someone who had consistently shown loyalty? Why did they ignore so many warning signs? Why did they become so determined to believe the worst? Those questions become difficult to answer because they force the betrayer to confront something uncomfortable. They may not have been the strategist they thought they were. They may have been the strategy. Think about it. How many times have you watched someone throw away a healthy relationship for a temporary illusion? How many times have you seen people sacrifice genuine connection in exchange for approval from individuals who later disappeared? How many times have you watched someone defend toxic influences while attacking the person who was actually trying to help them? At the time, it makes no sense. Later, It makes perfect sense. Because manipulation rarely announces itself as manipulation. It arrives disguised as validation. It arrives disguised as opportunity. It arrives disguised as empowerment. The person feels stronger while becoming more vulnerable. They feel smarter while becoming easier to influence. They feel independent while quietly surrendering their ability to think clearly. That's why the realization hits so hard. The betrayer eventually discovers they weren't leading the situation. They were being led. The decisions felt personal, but the influences behind those decisions often weren't. The anger felt authentic, but the people encouraging that anger frequently had agendas of their own. The confidence felt real, but it was built on assumptions that could not survive contact with reality. And reality always arrives eventually. This is where things become deeply uncomfortable. Because once a person realizes they were used, they must also confront the damage they helped create. They must acknowledge the relationships they abandoned. They must acknowledge the trust they violated. They must acknowledge that the person they blamed may have been the very person trying to protect them from making a mistake. That's not an easy burden to carry, especially when pride spent years insisting they were right. The truth is that many betrayers don't suffer because someone punishes them. They suffer because clarity arrives. They suffer because the story they told themselves begins collapsing. They suffer because they finally see the situation without the emotional filters that once distorted everything. And when that happens, one realization becomes impossible to avoid. They thought they were making moves against you. They thought they were gaining power. They thought they were winning, only to discover they were never holding the chessboard at all. They were simply another piece being moved across it. Number 2, the eviction of grace. One of the strangest experiences many betrayers go through is realizing that life became harder after they left. Not immediately. That's important to understand. In the beginning, everything often looks fine. Sometimes it even looks better. There may be excitement, new opportunities, new relationships, and the temporary confidence that comes from believing they made the right choice. From the outside, it appears as though they're thriving. But time has a way of revealing what emotions initially conceal. And that's when the friction begins. Listen carefully. Many people spend years benefiting from relationships they don't fully appreciate. They become so accustomed to someone's loyalty, wisdom, support, discernment, or stabilizing presence that they stop recognizing its value. Like oxygen, they only notice it after it's gone. You experience this more than you realize. You were often the calm voice in the storm. The person who could see problems before they arrived. The person who offered warnings nobody wanted to hear. The person who brought stability into situations that would have otherwise spiraled into chaos. The problem is that consistency rarely receives the same attention as drama. People notice excitement. People notice conflict. People notice novelty. But they often overlook the quiet blessing of having someone trustworthy in their corner. That's why the realization comes later. The betrayer eventually starts noticing that things don't flow the way they once did. Relationships become more complicated. Decisions become more costly. Situations that once resolved themselves smoothly suddenly become exhausting. The emotional clarity they took for granted seems harder to access. At first, they dismiss it. Then they rationalize it. Eventually, they start connecting the dots. Not because life became perfect when you were around. No relationship is perfect. No person is responsible for another person's destiny. But your presence often provided something they didn't recognize until it disappeared. Perspective. You saw things they couldn't see. You noticed patterns they ignored. You sensed danger before it became visible. And more often than not, you were right. That's what makes this realization so uncomfortable. The very qualities they dismissed begin proving their value after you're gone. Think about how many warnings they laughed at, how many concerns they minimized, how many conversations they brushed aside because they were convinced they knew better. At the time, your discernment felt restrictive to them. Your caution felt unnecessary. Your intuition felt exaggerated. Then reality starts catching up. The people you warned them about reveal their true intentions. The situations you question begin unfolding exactly as predicted. The shortcuts they chose create consequences they never anticipated. And suddenly your words start echoing in their mind. Not because you're there reminding them, because experience is reminding them. That's the difference. A lesson is easy to reject when it comes from another person. It's much harder to reject when life begins teaching the exact same lesson. Now watch this. One of the reasons this stage becomes so psychologically difficult is because it forces the betrayer to confront a painful possibility. What if the person they viewed as an obstacle was actually a source of protection? What if the person they accused of holding them back was one of the few people genuinely looking out for their well-being? What if the stability they took for granted was far more valuable than the excitement they chased? Those questions don't produce comfortable answers, and that's why many people avoid them for as long as possible. But eventually reality becomes impossible to ignore. The relationship they thought was limiting them may have been grounding them. The voice they dismissed may have been guiding them. The person they underestimated may have understood far more than they were willing to admit. That's when the illusion begins collapsing. Not because anyone forces it to, because truth has a way of resurfacing. And when it does, the betrayer is left facing one of the hardest realizations imaginable. They didn't lose a burden. They lost a blessing they were too distracted to recognize. And now that it's gone, they're finally beginning to understand what it was worth. Number 3, the echoes of discernment. One of the most uncomfortable stages in the betrayer's journey begins when memory starts replacing emotion. During the conflict, emotions were loud. Pride was loud. Outside influences were loud. The excitement of being validated by other people was loud. In that environment, your voice became easy to dismiss. Your concerns sounded negative. Your warnings sounded controlling. Your intuition sounded exaggerated. But time has a unique way of lowering the volume of emotion. And when the noise fades, memory remains. That's when the echoes begin. Listen carefully. Many chosen ones have experienced this pattern throughout their lives. They see things before other people see them. They notice inconsistencies before they become obvious. They sense danger while everyone else is still celebrating. They pick up on subtle shifts in character long before a betrayal fully reveals itself. The frustrating part is that these observations are rarely appreciated in real time. In fact, they're often criticized. People accuse you of overthinking. People accuse you of being too cautious. People accuse you of expecting the worst. And for a while, you may even question yourself. You may wonder if you're being unfair. You may wonder if you're imagining things. You may wonder if your intuition is simply anxiety disguised as wisdom. Then months pass, sometimes years, and the exact situation you were concerned about unfolds right in front of everyone. That's when the echoes start becoming impossible to ignore. The friend you warned them about eventually betrays them. The opportunity you questioned becomes a disaster. The person they defended reveals their true character. The pattern you recognized early becomes obvious to everyone else. And suddenly they're remembering conversations they once dismissed. Not because you're reminding them, because reality is. That's what makes this stage so powerful. The lesson is no longer theoretical. It's personal. The betrayer starts replaying moments they barely paid attention to before. They remember your hesitation around certain people. They remember the concerns you tried to express. They remember the situations where you quietly stepped back while everyone else rushed forward. At the time, they interpreted those actions as weakness, fear, negativity, or insecurity. Now they're beginning to understand something different. You weren't reacting from fear. You were responding to information they couldn't yet see. That's a difficult realization to process, because it requires humility. It requires admitting that the person they underestimated may have understood the situation more clearly than they did. And pride doesn't surrender easily. For a while, many people try to resist this realization. They tell themselves it was coincidence. They tell themselves you simply got lucky. They tell themselves anyone could have seen it coming. But deep down, they know that's not true. Because this wasn't a one-time event. It happened repeatedly. Again and again, you noticed patterns before they became visible. Again and again, you recognized problems before they became crises. Again and again, your discernment proved more accurate than the opinions of the crowd. That's what starts haunting them. Not your words, your accuracy. Because every fulfilled warning becomes evidence that they ignored something valuable. Every prediction that came true becomes a reminder that they dismissed someone they should have listened to. Every lesson learned the hard way becomes a reminder that the easier lesson was available all along. Now watch this. The reason this realization becomes so emotionally heavy isn't because they're afraid of being wrong. Everyone is wrong sometimes. The real pain comes from understanding the cost of being wrong. The relationships damaged, the trust broken, the opportunities lost, the unnecessary suffering. Those things can't always be recovered. And that's why the echoes grow louder with time. Not because you're speaking, because experience keeps confirming what you tried to tell them years ago. Eventually, many betrayers reach a place where they can no longer deny the truth. The intuition they mocked wasn't weakness. The caution they criticized wasn't fear. The discernment they dismissed wasn't negativity. It was wisdom. Wisdom they failed to recognize when it was standing right in front of them. And now, every time life proves you right, they're forced to confront a reality that becomes harder to escape. The person they underestimated may have been the clearest voice in the room all along. Number 4, internal karma. This is the part many people misunderstand. When they think about karma, they imagine dramatic consequences. They imagine public exposure, financial loss, humiliation, or some visible form of punishment. They imagine a day when everyone suddenly discovers the truth, and the betrayer is forced to face the consequences in front of an audience. But some of the most powerful forms of karma are invisible. They happen behind closed doors. They happen in silence. They happen in the private moments when a person can no longer escape themselves. Listen carefully. One of the greatest misconceptions about guilt is that it arrives immediately. Most of the time, it doesn't. In the beginning, people justify their actions. They create narratives that allow them to feel comfortable with their decisions. They surround themselves with people who reinforce those narratives. They stay busy. They stay distracted. They stay focused on moving forward. For a while, that works. But eventually, life slows down. The distractions lose their power. The excitement fades. And when the noise disappears, the conscience begins speaking. That's when internal karma begins. Not because someone is punishing them, because truth is catching up to them. Think about it. A person can run from another individual. They can block a phone number. They can leave a relationship. They can move to a different city. They can create an entirely new life. But there is one thing they can never leave behind: their own awareness. And that's where the real struggle starts. Because once clarity arrives, every decision has to be revisited. Every excuse has to be re-examined. Every moment they ignored their better judgment begins resurfacing. Conversations they barely thought about suddenly feel significant. Warnings they laughed at begin sounding different. Choices they once defended become harder to justify. The mind starts replaying everything, not because it wants to suffer, because it wants resolution. But some situations don't offer easy resolution, especially when the damage can't be undone. That's why many people experience a form of psychological warfare that nobody else can see. During the day, they may appear fine. They may smile. They may continue living their life. They may convince everyone around them that they're completely at peace with what happened. Then night arrives. The distractions disappear. The room becomes quiet. And suddenly there's nothing left to drown out the questions. What if they were wrong? What if they hurt someone who genuinely cared about them? What if their pride cost them something they can't replace? What if the person they blamed was never the problem? Those questions are powerful because they don't require anyone else's involvement. They emerge from within. And once they appear, they tend to return again and again until they're addressed. Now watch this. The reason internal karma can be so intense is because it doesn't operate on a schedule. It shows up unexpectedly. A memory appears while driving. A conversation resurfaces while lying awake at night. A familiar phrase reminds them of something they tried to forget. A situation unfolds that suddenly makes them understand what you were trying to tell them years ago. And each time it happens, the weight grows a little heavier. Not because you're doing anything, because they're finally seeing clearly. That's the irony. The chosen one often spends years being misunderstood, while the betrayer spends years misunderstanding. Then one day the roles reverse. The chosen one finds peace, while the betrayer becomes trapped inside questions they can no longer answer. That's why revenge becomes unnecessary. Life has already created the lesson. The conscience has already begun the conversation. And unlike an external punishment, internal karma cannot be escaped through denial forever. Eventually, every person must sit alone with the truth of their own choices. That's what makes this stage so significant. The punishment isn't public embarrassment. The punishment isn't failure. The punishment isn't even loss. The punishment is awareness. Awareness of what they did. Awareness of what they ignored. Awareness of what they threw away. And for many people, that awareness becomes a prison far more powerful than anything another person could ever create. Because when the mind finally accepts what the ego spent years rejecting, the hardest person to live with becomes the one staring back from the mirror. Number 5, the untouchable upgrade. After everything you've survived, everything you've learned, and everything you've had to release, there is one final truth that needs to be understood. You won. Not because they apologized. Not because they admitted they were wrong. Not because justice arrived in the exact form you imagined. You won because you kept moving forward. That's the part many people miss. For a long time, it may have felt like the story was about betrayal, about deception, about people choosing the wrong side, about watching individuals abandon you when you needed them most. But looking back now, you can see something much deeper was happening. The situation was never just revealing who they were. It was revealing who you were becoming. Every disappointment strengthened your discernment. Every betrayal strengthened your boundaries. Every season of isolation strengthened your relationship with yourself. Every attempt to pull you off your path forced you to become more aligned with it. What they intended as a setback became an upgrade. And that's why you're untouchable now in a way you weren't before. Listen carefully. Being untouchable doesn't mean nobody criticizes you. It doesn't mean challenges disappear. It doesn't mean you'll never experience disappointment again. Real power is something far less dramatic. Real power is no longer needing validation from people who misjudged you. Real power is no longer chasing closure from people who refuse accountability. Real power is no longer carrying emotional attachments to chapters that have already ended. That's the upgrade. The people who betrayed you are still wrestling with the past. They're still trying to understand decisions they can't undo. They're still revisiting moments they wish they had handled differently. Meanwhile, you've been building. You've been healing. You've been creating a life that no longer revolves around what happened. That's why indifference becomes the final victory. Not hatred, not revenge, not obsession. Indifference. Because indifference means you've reclaimed ownership of your energy. It means your future is no longer connected to someone else's mistakes. It means you've stopped asking life to reverse the past and started focusing on creating something greater than it. And that's where many chosen ones are standing right now. The lesson has been learned. The attachment has been released. The chapter has been closed. What remains is growth. What remains is wisdom. What remains is a version of yourself that could never have existed without everything you survived. So if you've been waiting for confirmation, let this be it. You don't need revenge. You don't need an apology. You don't need everyone to understand your story. You only need to continue becoming the person you were always meant to be. If this message resonated with your journey, subscribe to the channel, share this video with someone who needs this reminder, and comment untouchable below. Because the greatest victory was never watching them lose. The greatest victory was discovering that their betrayal could not stop your destiny. They thought they were ending your story. In reality, They were introducing you to your next level.